He came home earlier than planned. And that was his biggest mistake. Taleb heard muffled laughter and voices from the bedroom before he even stepped inside. One of them belonged to his wife. The other, to Martin, his best friend. His heart stopped. He slowly pushed the door open and saw them together. His world shattered. But he didn't scream. He didn't make a scene. He just walked away. Because he knew, revenge is best served cold. Taleb sat in the kitchen, staring at his cup of unfinished coffee. His wife, Malia, was next to him, scrolling through her phone and absent-mindedly tapping her finger on the table. "Do you have the day off today?" she asked without looking up from the screen. "Yeah, I think I'll just relax," Taleb replied, taking a sip. This morning felt ordinary, just like any other. But there was a strange tension in the air, something he couldn't quite explain. She had seemed distant for the past few weeks. She spoke less, touched him less often. Maybe it was just his imagination. "If you want, we could go somewhere," he suggested. Malia glanced at him briefly and smiled. "Maybe another time." Taleb was about to respond, but then the doorbell rang. He got up, feeling an odd sense of unease. When he opened the door, his heart stopped. Standing on the threshold was Martin, his childhood friend, whom he hadn't seen in years. Martin had barely changed. The same self-assured smile, light stubble, and that cunning glint in his eyes. "Well, hello there, my friend," he said, spreading his arms wide. Taleb didn't react right away. His mind was struggling to grasp whether this was reality or a dream. "Martin? What the hell are you doing here? Can I come in?" Martin smiled as if nothing unusual was happening. Taleb stepped aside, letting him in. Malia peeked out from the kitchen, her eyebrows raising in surprise. "Oh, we have a guest?" "Yeah." Taleb still couldn't process what was happening. "This is my old friend, Martin." Martin gave Malia an appraising look. "Nice to meet you," he said with that same smile that always seemed a little too confident. Malia nodded, but didn't linger. "I'll leave you two to talk," she said and disappeared into another room. Taleb gestured for Martin to sit in the kitchen. He poured him a cup of coffee, and they sat across from each other. "I can't believe you're here," Taleb finally said. "I didn't plan on it myself," Martin replied seriously. His smile was gone. "I have bad news." Something in his voice made Taleb tense up. "What happened?" Martin exhaled heavily. "It's about your parents." Taleb felt his heart pound harder. "What about them?" "They?" Martin hesitated, as if unsure how to say it. "They passed away." Taleb stared at him, not understanding the meaning of the words. "What?" "A week ago, a car accident. They didn't survive." The room seemed to sway. Blood rushed to his head. His hands trembled. "This must be a mistake." Martin placed a hand on his shoulder. "I wanted to tell you sooner, but I didn't know how. I'm so sorry." Taleb felt the air grow heavy. His parents, the only people who had always been his support, gone. "I need to go," he said almost mechanically. "Yeah." Martin nodded. "I'll go with you." Taleb only nodded silently. He was too shattered to analyze the situation. He didn't even notice the way Malia was looking at him as he packed his things. He left the next morning. For some reason, Martin stayed behind. "Someone has to look after your wife while you're gone," he said, and Taleb didn't even think about those words. Malia hugged him before he left, but her gaze was different. He didn't notice, but Martin did, and he knew exactly what to do. The road was long, and the whole time, Taleb felt like he was drifting in a fog. When he arrived, the pain only deepened. His parents were gone. The house he grew up in felt foreign. He stayed there for a week. The whole time, Martin kept sending him messages. "How are you? Malia misses you. She's so lonely without you." Taleb barely responded. But after a week, he decided it was time to go home. He thought that after everything that had happened, he would need his wife's support. He thought he would find peace at home, but he had no idea what was actually waiting for him. When Taleb returned, something felt off. The door wasn't locked. The apartment smelled of someone else's perfume. He took a few steps down the hallway and froze. Sounds were coming from the bedroom. Voices. Laughter. Taleb didn't move. And then he heard a familiar voice. "You have no idea how long I've waited for this moment." Martin's voice. And Malia's laughter. It felt like everything around him had fallen into silence. He didn't want to believe it, but he knew the truth. His friend, his wife, his home, his life. He slowly unclenched his fingers. He could have stormed in right then, but something stopped him. He wouldn't act rashly. He wouldn't scream. He would wait. And when the right moment came, he would strike. Taleb stood in the dark hallway, holding his breath. Malia and Martin's laughter drifted from the bedroom, as if they weren't afraid of being heard anymore. He clenched his fists. His wife, his friend, his home. They thought he had left for a long time. They thought he was still far away. He could have just barged into the room, seen them together, and ended it all right there. But he didn't. He slowly stepped back, silently left the apartment, and closed the door behind him. He wouldn't be reckless. He would wait, and he would make sure they never even realized when exactly they had lost. Taleb returned a few hours later, when it was already late. The apartment was dimly lit. Malia was sitting in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, drinking tea. She looked up when he walked in, and for a moment, fear flashed in her eyes. But then she quickly smiled. "Darling." She put down her cup and got up to hug him. "Why didn't you tell me you were coming back today?" Her arms wrapped around his neck, but he felt no warmth. "I wanted to surprise you," Taleb answered evenly. He hugged her back, inhaling her scent. His hands tightened around her waist, making her body tense slightly. "I missed you so much," she whispered. Taleb didn't respond. He simply let go of her and walked into the living room. "Have you eaten?" he asked. "Yes, a little." She sat beside him, watching him closely. "How are you? How did everything go?" He pretended to be exhausted and rubbed his face with his hands. "It was hard," he said quietly. Her fingers touched his hand. "You're home now. We'll get through this together." His gaze locked onto hers. She was lying, and she thought he didn't know. The next morning, Taleb woke up to the smell of coffee. Malia was standing by the stove, making breakfast, while Martin sat at the table. He acted like this was his home. He looked calm, even relaxed. Taleb felt something boiling inside him. "Good morning, brother." Martin smiled, taking a sip of coffee. Taleb didn't reply, just sat down at the table and picked up a spoon. "Martin helped me a lot while you were gone," Malia said with a gentle smile. "I'm sure he did," Taleb answered calmly. He saw Martin's fingers brush the table, just a little too close to Malia's hand. Her shoulders tensed slightly, but she quickly looked away. They were trying to hide their game, but he already knew, and he would wait for the moment to make them pay. The following days felt like a chess match. Martin acted as if he had lived there for a long time. He stayed late, talked to Malia in an unsettling closeness, even used Taleb's things. But Taleb said nothing. He simply watched. He saw how Malia became more cautious when he was around. He saw how she looked away when he tried to meet her gaze. One day, when she came out of the shower, he noticed a faint red scratch on her neck. He knew he hadn't put it there. She realized it too when she saw his gaze. And for a second, he saw fear in her eyes. But he only smiled. "You look beautiful today," he said as if nothing had happened. Malia blinked, unsure how to react. "Thank you, love." He said nothing more, but she felt that something had changed. A week after his return, something happened that turned everything upside down. That evening, when Taleb came home, he saw Malia talking to someone in the hallway. A woman's voice, one he hadn't heard in a long time. When he stepped inside, the woman turned to face him. His heart stopped. It was Sarah, his ex. But that wasn't the worst part. Standing beside her was a little girl, a child. Sarah was holding an envelope in her hands. "We need to talk, Taleb," she said quietly. His throat went dry. "What are you doing here?" She handed him the envelope. "These are DNA test results." Taleb took it, never taking his eyes off her. He opened the paper and skimmed the first few lines. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. The room swayed in front of his eyes. "What?" Sarah stepped forward. "She's your daughter." Everything blurred together in his mind. Malia's betrayal, Martin in his home, and now this. He lifted his gaze to Malia. Her face was as pale as chalk, and in her eyes, fear. "Taleb," she whispered. This is a joke?" But it wasn't a joke. It was real, and he had no idea what to do. Taleb felt his world shattering into pieces. He stood in his own hallway, holding the DNA test results, while his ex, Sarah, waited in silence for his reaction. Beside her stood the little girl. His daughter. Malia stood off to the side, her face so pale she looked like she might faint. Is this a joke? Her voice trembled. Sarah crossed her arms. I wouldn't have come all this way for nothing. Taleb stared at the paper in his hands. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. He couldn't believe it. It all felt like some cruel prank. He looked back at Sarah. Why did you stay silent all these years? She pressed her lips together. Because I wasn't sure. At first, I thought, but now I know for certain. Taleb's eyes drifted back to the little girl. She was about 5 years old. Black curly hair, big eyes. His daughter. He didn't know what to feel. But then he looked at Malia again, and for the first time, he saw true panic in her eyes. Taleb, let's talk. Her voice was tense, but he only stepped back. He needed to think. I need to go out, he said, and without waiting for a response, he walked out the door. The cold night air hit his face as he stepped outside. He had no idea where he was going. He just walked aimlessly, trying to make sense of the chaos in his mind. His wife had betrayed him with his best friend. Now he had just learned that he had a child he never even knew about. His life was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do about it. But was there really nothing he could do? He stopped near a park and took a deep breath. His heartbeat steadied. He would not be a victim. He wouldn't let them destroy his life so easily. He would make sure they regretted it. When he returned, it was past midnight. The apartment was filled with an eerie silence. Malia was sitting in the living room. Her face was tense. You finally came back. Her voice was even, but there was something uneasy in it. Taleb slowly walked over and sat in the chair across from her. Let's be honest, Malia. He crossed his arms. She bit her lip. About what? About everything. He waited, but she stayed silent. How long? He finally asked. Malia sighed. Taleb, I didn't want this to happen. How long? He repeated, louder this time. She lowered her eyes. Since you left. He felt rage ignite in his chest. She wasn't even trying to deny it. And now what? Are you planning to live together? Malia's head snapped up. What? No. But he lives here. In my home. His voice was cold. It's temporary. Temporary? He laughed. A cruel laugh. Malia felt it. She looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. Taleb, what are you planning? He didn't answer. He just smiled. You'll find out soon. The next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened. He made coffee, kissed Malia on the cheek, smiled at Martin. At first, Martin looked tense. He was clearly expecting a confrontation. But when it didn't come, he relaxed. And that was a mistake. Taleb had already started his game. He went to meet Sarah. She was waiting for him at a cafe, with their daughter sitting beside her. He stared at the little girl for a long time, and then he asked, What do you want from me? Sarah answered without hesitation, For you to be in her life. He was silent. His daughter. A new chance. A new future. He sighed and reached out his hand to the little girl. Taleb took out his phone and played the video. The voices were clear. He doesn't suspect a thing. I don't think so. Martin's face changed instantly. He turned pale. Malia, who was standing nearby, took a step back. Taleb lifted his head and looked at them. Now I know for sure. Martin tried to say something but couldn't. Malia covered her mouth with her hands. Taleb smiled. Pack your things. Malia shook her head. Taleb, you have 5 minutes. He leaned back in his chair, savoring the moment. They hadn't seen this coming. But this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Malia stood there, gripping the table, her face deathly pale. Martin was silent. He quickly glanced from Taleb to the phone, as if refusing to believe what he was seeing. Taleb, let's talk, he started. But Taleb cut him off. 5 minutes. His voice was calm, which only made it more terrifying. Martin stood up, clenching his fists. And what are you gonna do now? Throw me out of the house? Taleb slowly placed his coffee cup on the table. No. You're going to leave on your own. Martin scoffed, trying to maintain his confidence, but panic was already visible in his eyes. I'm not going anywhere. Taleb smiled and pulled out a second phone. Take a look at what I have. He pressed a button, and a video appeared on the screen. The cameras he had installed in the apartment had captured everything. How Malia let Martin into their bed. How they whispered about him, laughed, enjoyed the fact that he didn't suspect a thing. Martin stared at the screen as if he had seen a ghost. You were spying on us? Of course. Taleb calmly crossed his arms. And now this video can be seen by anyone. Martin shot a quick glance at Malia. She was in shock. Taleb, she whispered. What, Malia? His voice was ice cold. Did you think I would just forgive this? She took a step toward him. I made a mistake, but I love you. Taleb let out a short laugh. Love? You didn't even try to hide what you did. He turned to Martin. You have two options. Martin didn't respond. First, you pack your things right now and disappear. And the second? Martin gritted his teeth. Taleb unlocked his phone and pressed a few buttons. The second option, this video gets uploaded to every social media platform. Martin turned pale. You wouldn't do that. You think so? Silence filled the room. Martin stood there for a moment, as if debating whether to argue. Then, suddenly, he turned and stormed off to the bedroom to pack his things. Taleb turned his gaze to Malia. You should pack too. Her eyes widened. What? I don't want to see you in this house anymore. But this is my home too. Taleb slowly raised an eyebrow. No, Malia. It was our home until you destroyed it. She started breathing faster, as if panicking. Where am I supposed to go? To him. He nodded toward the bedroom, where Martin was throwing his clothes into a suitcase. Malia shook her head. I don't want to go to him. That's not my problem anymore. She took another step toward him, grabbing his hand. Taleb, I made a mistake. I was weak when you were gone, and he took advantage of that. Spare me the excuses. His voice remained calm. He pulled his hand away. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. Her eyes filled with tears. Do you really want to throw me out? Taleb sighed. I gave you everything I could, but it wasn't enough. Martin walked out of the room with his suitcase. Ready, Malia? His voice was mocking. She looked at him, and suddenly, everything became clear. Martin didn't want her. He just wanted to beat Taleb. And now that he had lost, he was leaving her behind. Malia turned back to Taleb. I made a mistake, she repeated. He nodded. Yes. Martin walked out the door without even saying goodbye. Malia stood in the hallway. I'm not going anywhere, she said quietly. Taleb frowned. What? This is my home too. She straightened, as if gathering her resolve. You want me gone? Try to make me leave. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Are you serious? She looked him straight in the eyes. You still love me, Taleb. His fists clenched. He hated her. But she was right. He still felt something for her. And that was the biggest problem. Taleb didn't sleep that night. Malia stayed in the apartment. She acted as if nothing had happened. He couldn't force her out. The apartment legally belonged to both of them. But he couldn't stand being around her anymore. He had to make a choice. He picked up his phone and made a call. Sarah answered immediately. Taleb? He inhaled. Can I come over? She was silent for a moment, then answered. Yes. He grabbed his keys and walked out of the apartment. Malia stood in the bedroom doorway, watching him. Where are you going? He held her gaze. Somewhere I'm actually wanted. He closed the door behind him. His heart was pounding. He didn't know what would happen next. But he knew one thing. He would no longer play by anyone else's rules. Did Taleb do the right thing by leaving Malia in the apartment, or should he have forced her out at any cost?